Bud McGuire had been expelled in his 10th grade, and 2 years later he was just in time to be drawn into the Vietnam War. Nobody is entirely sure what he got up to out there, but in 1975, when he returned to the village, it seemed as though a rage-filled blanket had been slung over Bud's shoulders. While he was away fighting illness, his father passed away, and Bud inherited the family's roughly 100 acres. This little farm had been in the family for 3 generations, just providing enough to maintain food in their stomachs and clothing on their backs. Bud McGuire was let down by the dirt, that heavy, dark soil of the Midwest. Every crop he planted, corn, beans, wheat, seemed to wither and perish at his hands. His other farmers were successful, the fertile soil of the region producing robust green rows of maize virtually overnight. Despite everything, Bud still managed to find a wife. A pallid slip of a girl was spotted hanging clothes on the McGuire farm's front yard in the fall of 1977, just 15 months after Bud returned from the war. She had wide blue eyes that were always fixated on the ground and long, mousy brown hair. Nobody knew who she was or where she came from. The community's women, who were all preoccupied with genealogy, would have been furious about this, but no information about the girl could be discovered. She had just recently been there, quietly tending to hens or scrubbing rugs. She never visited the town, never spoke to anybody. About a year following the arrival of this enigmatic woman, Andrew Lutz had his second professional contact with Bud McGuire. The neighborhood residents had thrown up their hands in disgust because despite all of their thoughtful actions and housewarming casseroles, the door had remained closed. The McGuire family had never been observed visiting any of the several churches in the neighborhood, and the young woman had never shown up at the grocery store where the wives might attack her. Righteous wrath had replaced the first uncertainty. Who did they think they were, camped out on their piece of land and being all haughty? The McGuires may have believed they were superior to their colleagues. However, the weeks passed and the young woman was nowhere to be seen in the town. When winter came, the few persons who traveled on the old county road could no longer see her outside. The townspeople's initial outrage started to turn into worry. Was she all right? Buddy had a notoriously bad temper, even before his time spent in the Vietnam War jungles. Finally, the women badgered their husbands in the spring of 1978, until the men had contacted the local police. To calm the anxieties of their anxious neighbors, the police then phoned the sheriff's department and requested that someone go check on the girl. Lutz, who was the junior deputy on duty at the time, left for the McGuire property by traveling along Highway 99. The terrain in March was a quagmire of mud that pulled at Lutz's boots as he got out of the police car, only 3 miles from the Mississippi River floodplains. The home was a classic farmhouse with 2 floors and sweeping gables that ascended to form an attic with a 3rd level. The entry was reached by a wide wraparound porch supported by substantial wooden beams. Lutz had taken a cautious check around before ascending the steps to the porch. He had twice knocked. No response. Lutz walked away from the home and instead went around the back, where sure enough, a little young woman was dividing up fresh spring herbs into a variety of bowls. This was something that had been anticipated. Lutz placed his hands in front of him to demonstrate that he meant no harm when she reacted like a scared cat upon seeing him. "Greetings, ma'am. I'm Deputy Lutz, and I work for the sheriff's office. Could I have your name?" He approached the girl slowly while speaking in a quiet, kind manner. The girl's blue eyes had been staring into his with an expression he couldn't decipher. "April." Little more than a breath out, the phrase had been barely audible, and Lutz was about to ask her to repeat herself when the girl's eyes narrowed and widened in horror at something beyond his shoulder. Lutz turned to look at Bud McGuire, who was standing a short distance behind them. Just like when he had looked at the dead dog, his dark eyes had been soulless and soulless. A double-barreled shotgun with a long, slender muzzle was leaning casually on his shoulder and directed at the sky. Thankfully, Lutz had avoided the impulse to jump at the sight of the big guy. "Bud, good morning," he said. Lutz had moved his hand to the revolver held at his hip with slow, methodical motions and thumbed open the clasp. As he was supposed to, Bud had taken note. Lutz realized this was the first time he had heard Bud speak as his mouth twisted in a frown and he answered, "You're not welcome here," in a flat, toneless voice. Lutz had answered in a firm voice, "I'll be leaving shortly. People have been inquiring as to how you two have survived up here by yourself for the entire winter. I decided to stop by and make sure everything was well." "Fine. You've observed." With those words, Bud covered the small distance separating him and his new bride. Lutz had been waiting for him to strike her so the deputy could take him into the station, but instead, Bud simply stood close to the girl with a look of utter rage on his face. Throughout this interaction, April McGuire had been completely silent. She now sprang up from her herb table as if she had been scalded. When she knelt, Lutz observed something he hadn't previously. A sizable wicker box covered in woolen blankets stood under the table. A little baby wrapped in a blanket was curled up and slept. Without saying anything further, the girl grabbed the basket and ran into the home. The shotgun was still perched on Bud's shoulder when he turned. "This is my land. There hasn't been a crime committed. You have no business being here." It was stated in the same spooky, deadpan voice throughout. Bud said everything with the same weird, deadpan tone, and it was all true. Bud had not been accused of anything by April McGuire. Possessing a firearm while on your own property wasn't illegal. Lutz had withdrawn back to the cruiser and was returning to the station since he had nothing else to say. Since that day about 8 years ago, he hadn't visited the McGuire property again. Only a few times in those 8 years had the McGuire family been spotted, either returning or departing along Highway 99 in Bud's beat-up Dodge Ram. They eventually welcomed a daughter into their family. Both the neighborhood Christian school and the neighborhood public school never saw either youngster. Lutz often took a leisurely drive down the county road in the hopes of spotting April McGuire or her kids playing in the yard. Lutz was compelled to continue driving since the home had been silent and closed. Most members of the neighborhood had long since ceased talking negatively about the McGuires throughout the years. Everyone felt sorry for the lonely young mother, her children, and Bud's rage. However, this group was also conservative and valued their right to privacy. Everyone simply shrugged their heads and continued living their lives as long as there didn't seem to be an issue at the McGuire farm, despite the fact that they were all aware of what was going to happen in the end. Sheriff Andrew Lutz was kicking himself for not doing more and for not making up a ludicrous excuse to go check on April and her kids as he came closer to the McGuire property. He only wished he hadn't arrived too late. However, it didn't seem like that was the case. Sir?" Andrew Lutz was abruptly awakened by Billy Hudson's voice from his remorse and sorrow. He was going to miss the blind turn in the road leading up to Bud's property because he was so preoccupied with his spooky thoughts. Instead, a giant pine tree was the target of the hefty police car. Chapter 3. When Lutz forcefully turned the steering wheel, the hefty automobile shrieked in protest and began to fishtail erratically across the road in long, arcing arcs before he was able to regain control. The sheriff positioned the car at the narrow gravel shoulder and made a sudden, heart-pounding decision to stop. The steering wheel was in a white-knuckle hold on his hands, and it took some effort to free them. When he turned off the engine, the only sound for a while was the silent ticking of the cooling engine. The beginning of the McGuire farm was ahead of this curve where the trees would open on one side. He was able to say, "Sorry about that, guys," at last. Officer Clarkson was staring at him in complete shock, as if he had just witnessed a mountain lion prowling across Iowa's farmlands. As the two cops unbuckled their seatbelts and went outside into the steamy summer night, Billy met his gaze in the rearview mirror with a stern expression. Lutz felt something strange right away, and his arms started to creep. He let Billy out of the cage in the back seat and signaled for Clarkson to follow. Lutz walked up to the trunk, took out the weapon, and gave it to Deputy Clarkson. Before locking the trunk, he took the shotgun and 2 high-beam spotlights. He handed Billy Hudson the shotgun and one of the flashlights with a gesture of understanding. In this area, all of the boys and the majority of the girls acquired shooting skills before turning 10. In a neighborhood where practically everyone's deep freezers were stuffed full of fresh venison every autumn, knowledge of weapons and firearm safety was reinforced at every turn. Lutz had no qualms about giving the younger man the shotgun. Even though he was too into drag racing, the young man possessed common sense. Lutz reached through his open driver's side door to switch off the headlights, but stopped himself after giving it some thought. Aside from the bulky mag light he now carried next to his service gun, they just had the weak light. The three of them turned to look around as he left the cruiser's lights on, slammed the door shut, and exited the car. Billy was able to express the strange feeling that was still crawling up the back of Lutz's neck. The young guy said, "All the bugs are silent." Lutz paid close attention and recognized he was correct. Since it was the height of summer, the air should have been heavy with humidity and alive with bug chirps. In other places, the nocturnal orchestra of katydids, cicadas, and crickets would be enough to drive a man halfway insane. But not here. Not even a mosquito buzzed. As the guys started to go northward toward Bud McGuire's house, the only sound they made was the soft tapping of their boots. Lutz turned on the powerful maglite after noticing that the headlights had no trouble piercing the darkness up front. Billy stood next to him holding the shotgun while pressing the tiny flashlight beneath the barrel with one hand. Deputy Clarkson had the long Winchester rifle at his shoulder and was prepared. Lutz was incredibly appreciative of its steadfastly dependable presence at this time, since it was typically utilized when a deputy needed to put down an injured animal on the side of the road. Lutz carefully and slowly moved the flashlight from one border of the road to the other. Billy was questioned. "Where did you say you saw this arm now, son?" Billy's voice echoed from the wall to his right, I believe a bit farther ahead. Perhaps another 300 feet or so. Lutz kept moving his flashlight carefully from side to side. He could see the scorched rubber left behind by tires that had abruptly skidded across the road at the edge of the beam. The tracks continued along the street, until disappearing into the night. The guys were now enough removed from the car's relative protection that the car's feeble headlights were no longer useful for piercing the darkness ahead. The two flashlights' beams appeared to get smaller and fainter as they progressed along the road in a haphazard configuration. The burned rubber skids Billy's tires had been making abruptly came to a halt approximately 6 feet in front of them. All three of the men came to a stop at once, their heads in their hands. On the edge of the road, when it turned into scrub vegetation, Billy's illumination revealed a human female's arm. There were bloody strips of flesh hanging from one end where it had been roughly ripped at the elbow. On the other end, the ring finger was encircled with a thin gold wedding band. The nails had dirt ingrained in them and were damaged.